Okay.
Oh,
All right, y'all. So today, it was kind of difficult. I know a lot of you, based off of your feedback, we're talking a lot about how you really wanted to start talking about interventions, and a lot of people just wanted more information on that. So we're going to go about this in a bit of a roundabout way today. I don't really think we need to look at the norms, but we're going to really hone in on looking at individual learner considerations. What do students with disabilities look like in Ohio? Knowing that we might be providing interventions to students who are not identified or maybe at risk, especially with the new House bill legislation around dyslexia. So we're going to have some time to really unpack some of the frameworks that we've talked about as it relates to a multi-tiered system of support. And we're going to look at it a little bit more closely. We're going to pull it apart a little bit because as leaders in your districts, anytime that you're bringing in something quote unquote new, it always seems like something extra, right? So we wanted to give you a chance to think about what are the current thoughts, perceptions as it relates to your tiers of supports, your identified students, your students who are at risk, to see maybe what you might need to change in order to effectively implement or start learning and growing your district or school around structured literacy practices. So we're gonna dive into some considerations that might seem like, why are we talking about this? Why are we pulling this apart? But that's truly why, because we can talk all day about what a good intervention looks like in a structured literacy setting, but if our collective district or school has practiced something in a different way and it's led to possibly some misconceptions, that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. What do we need to remove? What do we need to change before we do something new so that this just isn't something extra, something more to the plate, okay? So we're going to talk about that through some information around students with disabilities. Then we're going to then look through some supports that are available to you on how to select interventions, how to monitor interventions, and talk about some access things that you probably will be faced with when you start discussing these things in your teacher teams. So before we move on, we want to make sure that we reflect back to some of the topics of our last session. Last session, we talked a lot about curriculum. And a lot of you are right now going through processes specific to selecting new curriculum. And as it relates to that curriculum, you're specifically looking at programs, right? But as a reminder, when we say the word curriculum, we are really saying programs is just one little part of it, right? There is no perfect program because like it just technically does not work with the term curriculum, right? Like curriculum does not equal program. And program does not equal curriculum, right? So when we're talking about curriculum, and we're talking today about curriculum through the lens of possibly intervention programs, we're really needing to look at it through the lens of that includes the assessments that we utilize, the resources and materials that we select to either supplement or support the programs that we have in place. It also includes our lessons and activities, as well as the standards, right? All of those things encompass what we mean when we say curriculum. And why are we doing all of this? Why are we even talking about curriculum through the lens of literacy? As a reminder, we know that House Bill 436 is knocking at the door, and we're starting to, want to check things off about, okay, who has this PD and where are we at with our screeners? And we want to get things done because we want to go into summer and not have to worry about all these things. So Debbie, would you mind copy and pasting the sign in into the chat? Thank you. So as a reminder, implementing the components of House Bill 436 is going to support your overall school improvement efforts, right? We are not doing this through the lens of compliance. We are not meeting these things just to say, yep, we did it. We have 18 hours for all of our staff, moving on. we're doing this through an implementation, like a phase over many years, so that we can take the time to really look at our current practices, acknowledge what we're doing well, and then make some changes as we grow in our professional knowledge together. So just keeping that at the forefront. What's your unified message as we talk about the dyslexia legislation? So I do want to get, I love when Debbie shares on this, but we are specifically going to talk about students with disabilities, but we also want to remind all of us that a structured literacy setting or program or system is a requirement and essential for a lot of our learners, even our students who aren't identified. So this is something that I think we've very slightly touched on in the past, but Debbie, if you wouldn't mind just kind of walking through how they can utilize this and what this visual means and is trying to convey.
Yeah, so the thing that I relate to for myself is just my experiences with my own children. So if I'm looking at this chart by Nancy Young, and I'm looking up at the top part first, and the only reason I'm starting there is because I'm thinking about my oldest child. All right, so she learned to read effortlessly. She's what I would term a lucky one. It would not have mattered how she was taught there. She would have learned how to read regardless. And she's a very strong reader and has read consistently and effortlessly as long as I can remember. But then my other two children were a little bit different. So my son, my second born, he could not crack the code himself. Very intelligent boy, did great in school, but without a structured literacy approach, he could not figure out. He was born during that whole language time. And so I actually had to go buy a phonics program and teach it to him at home because he could not crack the code himself. Once he started another problem, but I kind of shudder to think, like, what if I had not been able to provide that for him? Like, what would have broken the code for him so that he could become an efficient reader and a skilled comprehender? Then my youngest child struggled the most. Things came very, very hard for her. She would have to work 3 and 4 times as long on things before she would get that. So for her, that structured literacy approach was absolutely essential for her success in the future. Same thing is that, unfortunately, the way that our district approached that was not structured literacy. And so think about all those children who didn't have an educator in their home. Like, who would have provided that structured literacy support that I was able to provide for my children? And so if we're looking at that, this is going to be about half of our children are going to fall into this category where they need this absolutely essential that they have that structured literacy approach. And then if we look down to our children who fall to the bottom, the kids who struggle the most, and that's going to be about 10% of our population, it is absolutely essential. They will not succeed without some explicit systematic instruction in multisensory approach. They absolutely will not be able to do it on their own if they don't have those supports in place.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think that's really powerful, because when we take this research and this visual and we parallel it to what we know about learners in Ohio, about 60% of our kids are needing reading, right? Especially throughout our region. And then we have 13-ish% across the state that are identified as students with disabilities. This chart kind of shows that and illustrates that. And historically, we have, maybe bumped up our systems. We start, having a systematic and explicit phonics instruction, and we see that bump up in our reading scores. And so this fluctuates, but if we consistently are seeing the same results and we're all working our tails off, then what is missing? What is missing from our structured literacy settings? And then what can we change in what we're currently doing to improve to be more effective? As a reminder, at the very beginning, we talked about when we're identifying students who are at risk for dyslexia through this legislation and with our screeners, majority of the time, those disabilities, as a reminder, we're not identifying anyone as dyslexic, but they're going to come up in that phonological deficit, fluency, word speed deficit areas of our assessments. So we know that we have a heavy emphasis, especially in those early learning years, on that word recognition side of the simple view of reading, and those which are those foundational skills that lead us to later reading comprehension. So as a caveat, we're going to talk a lot about those different areas again today when we give examples, but the reason being, we still have that language comprehension side of the simple view of reading, but we're going to have most of our learners who need that explicit structured literacy program falling in deficits in these areas. So before we jump into today's content, we just wanted to open the floor to y'all. Is there any burning questions? Having gone over that, is there anything that you're currently working through that is something that you've identified as a strength, or something that that you're planning for additional learning into next year? Anything as it just kind of relates to all things structured literacy. All right. And it makes sense that we are all kind of like, nah, nothing, because we haven't really got any new updates really as it relates to legislation. There is a Ohio channel, like a streaming will be available today, where the committee, in addition to the state board, will be discussing the draft of the dyslexia guidebook. So hopefully after today, come our May session, we'll be able to give you a little bit more details as you roll into planning for next year.
Yeah, and Jackie, I just want to share too, is it kind of as a celebration, is that the conversation that I'm hearing, especially in our region and across the state, how so many districts are puzzling through this whole thing and figuring out how to either strengthen their structured literacy or how they can transition into more structured literacy. So I just feel like that's really positive, and that our districts are responding to this and to the needs of our kids, which is really exciting. I think I'm really looking forward to the next couple of years to seeing the fruits of all these labors that are going on in all your districts right now.
Yes, very true, Debbie. You guys are reaching out, you're asking like, hey, can you brainstorm with me about this phonics program versus this phonics program? What would be a good tool to bring to teachers who might not have all the components of structured literacy, but are making curriculum choices on teams? You guys are really very vested in this, and 100% completely agree with you, Debbie. It deserves a round of applause.
I have a quick question, and
yeah,
maybe I'm getting ahead of the game, or you'll get to it, but you had briefly mentioned, just to remind, we're not identifying students with disabilities with dyslexia, but is there any more information on this markers versus tendencies language that's in the document? Like, because the way it reads, there's communication that you have to give if they have markers that's different. Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm talking about in the guidebook?
Yeah, I would agree that we have different vocabulary that are probably meaning the exact same thing. So difference between a marker or a tendency, to me, in my mind, it kind of speaks to the same the same thing. And what Stephanie is referring to is really important for us to understand that we as educators cannot diagnose a child with dyslexia. So we cannot tell a parent that their child has dyslexia based on our screener. That can only be done by a medical professional that has been trained in that. So as educators, we can just identify that this child is showing some tendencies that we might see in a child with dyslexia. And this is the way that we're going to intervene very quickly and efficiently to close those gaps for those children so that they're never identified. That's the whole intention of the law. But be very, very careful is that we cannot tell a parent that their child has dyslexia. That has to go to a medical doctor for that diagnosis.
And in our practices, when we do send that, it is not a requirement to identify a student with an educational reading deficit through an IEP, should you go to the evaluation and say that they have indicators or at-risk, signs of dyslexia. And in order to qualify them, let's say for a specific learning disability, you do not need that formal evaluation that says X, specialist has identified X student with dyslexia, right? We do not, that is not a requirement for an educational determination in order for a student to qualify, should that be a route that you need to take.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm still not, and maybe I'll have the conversation or learning some ways else, but in the guidebook on page 3, and it talks about the communication to the parents and the law, there's 3 bullet points, and one says if they're progress monitored and do not demonstrate, they have to get the tier 2, right? The second bullet point says if the student is identified as having dyslexic tendencies, the parent, guardian, or custodian should be provided with information about reading development and the risk factors of dyslexia. Third bullet says if a student demonstrates markers for dyslexia, the parent, guardian, or custodian must provide a written explanation of the district or school's multisensory structured literacy. I don't know what the difference between markers and tendencies is, and then therefore what communication needs to happen for which type of kid.
No, Stephanie, I think that would be great feedback for the committee that's putting this guidebook together. So if there's a, do you have that email for how to communicate with the committee? Because if not, we'll put that in the chat.
That'd be great. Put it in the chat.
Yeah, because that would be great feedback. If they could identify for us, what is the difference between a tendency and a marker? What is their definition?
Because I'm seeing those are 2 different types of kids.
So the way that I interpret that, and this is just Jackie's interpretation, that if a student has a marker or a tendency identified, there's 2 things that need to be a component of that family communication. One, what are some supports that family could do as it relates to their child's development, support the improvement of their language and literacy skills. So like the home part. In addition, here's what our tiered system of support is going to be able to provide. We have, a structured literacy approach that has an explicit, scope and sequence for XYZ sub skills, including blah, 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 whatever like that is. So in my mind, it's 1 letter with 2 purposes, right? Here are supports. Here's what we're going to do to support.
And that could be true. That's what I'm wondering. Right.
So yeah, that's
they all
definitely
get the same letter, or certain kids with tendencies get this letter and certain kids with markers get this letter.
Right, that clarity does need to explicitly be provided. And I will say at the OAESA, those literacy roundtable meetings, one of the things that they shared was combining our communication efforts for families, so that we're not sending like 5 things for different things. So if they are supposed to be, within the same, that we don't need to do, multiple separate things for a student. But I get what you're saying. That vocabulary could allude to them being 2 different quote unquote groups of learners.
All right. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to derail us.
No, that is not derailing at all. That's why we opened the floor up. This is a great question.
The email's in the chat now as well.
I guess that's kind of, I'm looking at the draft and I've reviewed it, and a lot of it just seems like such a gray area. There are so many ways to interpret it. And I guess that's why I'm glad we're talking about this now, because there's a lot of things that need to be clarified. Like if you want us to do this, and it needs to be explicitly stated.
Right.
Because otherwise you're going to have different things going on in different districts depending on the interpretation. So hopefully they'll clear that up for us. So it's not, I feel like we're working so hard on this, we're not getting anywhere because we don't know what to do yet.
Right. And I completely agree with you, Amy. I think, the overall intent was like, we're going to get this legislation, and then one component of it is this guidebook that technically, according to the legislation, no one has to follow like explicitly line by line, but that is one component of the law. And so what this guidebook's trying to do, I feel like, is they're putting the requirements in addition to best practices all in one, without saying like, hey, star area, this is an expectation that you have to complete. So one of the things that might be beneficial is when you're looking at that guidebook, look at it alongside that 2-page document that has the specific requirements spelled out that you have to do like year by year. So I would kind of always go back to that. And I'm going to put this 2-page link in the chat. And that all that is just the legislation specifics as it relates to screening, that professional learning, in addition to the certification process, and then the timeline for giving those screeners based off grade levels and all of that. Any other thoughts? Melissa?
Yeah, the question I have is about the certification process, just ideas on like where your schools are at with that and how far along you are and what you're all doing. I work with 9 different school districts, and they're all kind of all over the board with where they're going and what they're doing. So I guess I just want to know, like, what are you all doing and where are you at in the process for certification? If anybody would be willing to share.
Well, I know Maria and Megan can hop in. We're from Toledo City, but we haven't heard anything yet. We are in the dark. But we're
Okay.
not at that point of, we're not the ones that make that decision. So I'm not exactly sure where that process is for us, unfortunately.
Okay, I work at the ESC, and so I get principals asking questions like, what should we be doing? Is there a deadline? Is there this, that? And I have a couple schools who have started, teachers with a training process through Orton Gillingham and Wilson, so forth. But then I have other schools saying, well, we're not doing anything yet. Should we be doing anything yet? So, they're kind of all at different places, and they're not sure what they should be doing, I guess. So I thought I'd ask that question to see, if other people are in the same situation, just kind of waiting to see, or if you've moved
Right.
forward, or where you're all at.
So in Toledo, I can honestly say, with what Amy was saying, we have been told to hold, that we are not to move forward to do anything at this time until more defined decisions have been made in regards to that committee, because there's such a stalemate going on there that we have been told to hold back.
Stephanie, did you have a comment on that, or is your hand still up?
Oh, I'm sorry, my hand was.
Okay, it's okay. So Melissa, what I would say is some of the top leaders, as they're working to revise their local literacy plans, and they're working based off of wherever they are as it relates to updating or redoing their one plan, they're trying to first decide on decisions for that. And then once they have that information, be able to determine, where they might have gaps. So a data source that you could suggest to your principals at this time would be, here's the professional development audit tool. Did you get that in the past? Get an idea of who has already received professional development at, like, based off of these accredited plus things, to see if you have individuals certified, and then get a baseline of like maybe where you might need to fill or not fill based off of that, as it relates to like creating your own policy or like around certification. From my understanding at this point, or from the schools that I've been working with, we're really not there yet. We're kind of waiting for the final updates and releases before writing anything into policy. Debbie, do you have anything to add to that?
Not a whole lot, but a little bit. The only thing that districts are required to do in this next coming year, the 22-23 school year, as it regards to the legislation, is to create your process. The certification doesn't have to be completed. It's just, what is your process for your district? Now, I do not anticipate that we are going to get any more guidance on that than what's already in the guidebook. So as we're working on this, we need to first determine what is the scope of the work that you see for this certified person for your district. Are they going to be a person who you want to train and work alongside teachers, like a literacy coach? Are they going to be a person that's going to have a dual job, that yes, we need them working with our teachers, but we also, since they have that certification, we also need them working with our kids with needs, because they have the most detailed training. So what in your district, what do you want this person to do? What does that look like? So that will be what you need to be determining and thinking about now. And then you need to choose, because they have already, they've already released the pathways that you can follow for certification. So then you can take a look at those pathways and you can see, okay, what pathway makes sense for our district? And you can choose that. Then you can be thinking about your last piece in that whole thing is the who. Who is the best person for this position? You know, if they're going to be working with teachers, are they a person who's well respected, that teachers will be open to their, to their thinking and their coaching and their support? So right now, I really would, I guess, advise that maybe we should be working on that process right now, because I don't think we're going to get any more guidance, to be totally honest with you. So I really be thinking about what does that look like in your district and get that really written out in a very detailed way as to what you want that position to do and how you want it to support our district. And I see them talking about letters. Just so you know, letters is not a pathway to certification. Okay, so it doesn't have that component where you're working with kids. You have to have that that practice piece, and letters does not meet that requirement. So just so you know that, they have a bridge to practice, but it isn't rigorous enough to meet the process. So I hope that helps. Any more thoughts or questions around that?
Thank you. That helped a lot. So I think we're on track with what everybody else is doing here. So thank you.
Good. You're welcome.
Jackie?
Someone have a question? I feel like someone came off mute for a second. Pam just popped in the chat. IDA speaks to dyslexia as, oh, sorry, did someone? Diana?
Oh, Jackie, can you hear me? I'm sorry. Our school psych is on the dyslexia committee that's writing the guidebook. So I texted her really quick on that question between the markers and the tendencies. And she said, great question. We have struggled with that in many meetings. She says she believes where they landed was that markers are skills that the tests pick up on, and tendencies are the behaviors that you see.
So is it seen as two different pools of students, or should the word tendency and marker be used for both of those bullets?
I'm
For the-
sorry, you say that again?
So students displaying tendencies, the requirement to send language and literacy stuff home. Should it say tendencies or markers for that bullet, as well as tendencies or markers, and here's our tiered system of supports? Or are they seeing tendencies as a different group of learners and markers as a different group of learners? Am I paraphrasing that right, Stephanie?
Yeah, she seemed to indicate that the markers were just things that the test, skills that tests pick up. So like if a test identifies a skill that we would know would lead to dyslexia, then that would be those markers. And the tendencies, she said, are behaviors that you see. So things, I don't know if she's directly saying things in the classroom or what, but that was where that's what she landed on, it's telling me. Doesn't really clear it up, I don't think, but.
Right, and I think that makes sense. It's just knowing if those words could be applicable to the requirements for the family communication piece, both of those words. Thank you for doing that. Pam put in the chat, IDA speaks to dyslexia as a type of specific learning disability. The guidance says, oh, we have always received is that we do not request a medical diagnosis for educational categories. Pam, that's what I was alluding to. Like, you do not need a medical diagnosis in order to identify a student under specific learning disability with the primary need being dyslexia. Does not mean that you can't have it. If you have it, you can, but you do not need to require it. And then Karen, can you help with why letters is on the ODE website as an appropriate certification? So the ODE or letters, remember we have ADE or IDA has a list of accredited and accredited plus. Accredited programs means that the content from that learning can be applied towards that 18 hours. Accredited plus means there's an additional, like almost like a implementation component where you have to implement X, component of a program and get results of that as it relates to student achievement and learning, like to show progress monitoring or whatever it would be. So kind of like if you have to do hours for, your mentor program that have to be, classroom facing. So that accredited plus is those programs are specific to the multi-sensory structured literacy certification. That is not the certification is just, we just need to have one of those per LEA. The professional development hours are something that we all have to have, but we don't have to all do the certification piece.
Yeah, so the plus will have a practicum attached to it that's pretty rigorous. So if a person is going to know if they're certified, they're absolutely going to know it because it's rigorous. And the bridge to practice in letters does not meet that. It could meet the criteria for the 18 hours.
Correct. So
I was looking into the Wilson program because I took the introductory course last summer, and to go on to like the accredited plus, I have to take it's like 90 hours worth of coursework, and then I also have to do a practicum. So it's combined, and during the practicum, like I have to be observed for so many hours. Whoever is observing me is giving me feedback. The Wilson is set up where there's 10 steps in a lesson, and so you have to go through each step. It's very rigorous. I mean, it's, I would like to try it, but I don't know if I would have the time to do it and plus do my job during the school year. That's kind of what I'm wrestling with right now.
and that's why in the legislation, it says districts need to complete a policy for how you would get that certification. Because you're right, Amy, like what you can't go and do that and then still be able to quote unquote function with your regular roles and responsibilities, right? And if it's something that says in law that this certification is something that's needed, then you're going to have all these teachers that are wanting to do this, and then districts that really can't, support that. So what is the local policy? Like we hire someone every year, and this is the certification program, accredited plus program that we utilize, and we provide it, or we hope that people applying already have the requirements of the certification. Those are the specifics that your district needs to decide, so that, because it would be absolutely impossible for everyone to just run out and go get certification, right? That just wouldn't work. So that's why your district needs to create your local policy of what that looks like. And Melissa dropped a pathway to certification in the chat. That could be a good framework to kind of utilize as you're developing that. All right.
And all of the programs that want to be considered a pathway for certification have to go through that SERI vetting process in order to get on the list. And I look for that list to continue to grow as this goes on, as the years goes on. More programs will be adjusting their program to meet that requirement.
Right, and Sherry said, at this point, one person needs to be that for the district. That is true. There was a confusion around that because in the guidebook, it showed best practice that at all of your building leadership teams, that this person should be, a part of those teams and then those decisions. But this person needs to be able to have the expertise to support the identification and to support teams. So when Debbie was saying, what do we want this certified person to look like in our system? You could decide, if you're like a larger district, hey, we want 5 and we want them in this building, and this building, because no ratio is provided. If you're a smaller district and you're like, hey, we're just going to contract this out through our ESC, and that person will come and, be a part of our teams and our discussions when we need it, or after we get our universal screening results back. That can look so different based off of the needs that you have and how you're going to either start rolling out a structured literacy program, or how you continue to add to the elements of your current program. Does that answer your question, Sherry?
Can I ask a question or make a comment?
Absolutely.
So which brings me to, like, Debbie had said, the only thing we have to do for next year is have that multi-certification process in place. How we do have to start screening next year, right? And, like when we say like, hold on or wait and see, we really can't, because if we go screen somebody and we do a tier 2 screener, then we have to tell the parent what our structured literacy program is. What if we don't have it? I'm not saying that we
Right.
don't or we won't here in my district necessarily, but what if we don't? And
Right.
so you almost have to start moving on making that decision on what you're going to put in place if you're not currently operating in a structured lit. We have some things in place right now, but I don't know if that's enough. Like, we're still using Fontes and Pinnell. I'll just speak for my district. That is a balanced literacy, but we've put in a phonics portion and we've put in integrity. Is that enough? When I describe that process to my parent, am I okay?
Well, and I think ultimately, that's going to be a case by case basis. And so like effective, proactive communication up front, like an intro letter, like we've talked about in the past, the beginning of the year, that says, hey, as we continue to learn new research, here's our plan for implementing and supplementing to ensure we have explicit instruction around structured literacy practices, and not having all of that in place right out the bat is going to be okay. And really what the law says is that that structured literacy program doesn't have to be something that's occurring across all classrooms. It just needs to be specific for those learners. So if it's diagnostic, explicit, and systematic for the identified at-risk learners, then technically yes. But I love the way that you're thinking, Stephanie, because we know, okay, well, what's the point of doing that? Like if we're going to, bring in a new phonics program, for example, then we're gonna wanna make sure that it's a part of all of our classes. And we know that it's gonna meet the standards that we have and it's gonna be effective and et cetera, et cetera. So I think acknowledging that, you're learning and growing and you're getting this new information and you're getting the, guidance from this dyslexia guidebook that, isn't out yet, but, you're going to be using it to lead some of your leadership team meeting discussions around school improvement, et cetera. Those are the types of things that I think we could communicate to parents, on the onset, so that when we do get to that individual letter that needs to come based off of, a tendency or a marker of dyslexia, then they'll already know what we're kind of talking about. They're not going to be hit with this thing and think that this like, oh, this means that their instruction is completely changing, because they already know kind of what you're doing. And then that would be the opportunity then to be specific to their individual child's needs.
I want to speak to the screener a little bit because Stephanie is right. The legislation is going to go forward whether the State Board of Education approves it or not in a timely manner, which they're already not timely. But let me address the screener a little bit. So we know that best practice, we should be screening our kids 3 times a year. So you all know that. They have not released the screeners yet because it's being held up in the State Board of Education. So for this first year, you can all kind of take a little bit of a relief in that we understand that at this late date, if you are not using one of the approved screeners, time has run out or is quickly running out in your ability to purchase a new screener and get everybody trained on it in time to screen in the fall. All right, so even though this will not be best practice, what the legislation says is that next year you have to screen. It doesn't say when. So if it gets held up and it's not released until July, let's say, so you're in the process of, I'm not using one of those approved screeners, so I've got to purchase it and I've got to train it. It might be for your district this next year that particular screener, you won't give that until February of next year, which is not best practice, but you will meet the letter of the law. So you can kind of rest easy on that. But we also know best practice is to screen 3 times a year. So whatever you're doing, I would continue to do that in the fall so that we are screening in the fall. Plus you in 3rd grade reading guarantee. So we're not giving so many assessments, but you can kind of rest easy on that portion of it. And then we're going to all pray that our screener that we're using in our district is on that list.
Thank you, Debbie. And we also know what indicators need to be assessed when we want to look at a universal screener, and those are in the guidebook, and we can look at our current assessments, and a lot of your vendors, a lot of the big vendors that we're all currently using already have something in place to add on those additional sub skills that maybe perhaps we were not assessing in our universal screeners in the fall. So even if we don't know the list, we know what it will be supplemented. Most vendors have it. We can just add that to the universal screener that we're currently utilizing.
Jackie, can I add one thing?
Yes.
We had conversation in my district about kindergarten, because when you're looking at the legislation, they're saying kindergarten after January. And so we had a conversation, we don't want to wait till after January. So we're still going to give it 3 times a year beginning in the fall, but that fall one will just be for us. We'll do with that data, what we want to do with it. But when it comes to meeting requirements, then we'll look at that, the one after January. That's just also a good conversation to have.
Yeah, I love that. And those are the types of things that are great conversations to do now, right? I wouldn't take any practices that you already know are effective and you're doing and utilizing off the table while we wait.
Yeah, and speaking also to another point that Stephanie made, in that this legislation is just going into effect in the fall. All right, so we know that there are many districts in our state that are going to need to make some changes within their district. We all know that, excuse me, but it's an unfunded mandate. And so we cannot expect that all districts will have all of this in place, ready to go for fall. You know, like Stephanie was talking, like they put in, you know, some phonological awareness curriculum. They put in some structured literacy in phonics. So they're in the process of moving to a structured literacy approach, but that's slow going. That's not going to happen overnight. And we understand that many of our districts are in very similar situations. And so because it's unfunded, that does give a bit of a leeway, and there's for you as well as a district. So just to keep that in mind.
Can
Any
I go
other
back to
final
the
thoughts?
screener conversation? I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate with my questions here, but when somebody had just mentioned like we already do dibbles 3 times a year. We're crossing our fingers that that's what going to be able, and we too, that would be just for us. Am I correct though, that you really could have until that kid's a first grader, because it says administered to students in kindergarten after January 1, so you have to use the one after that. You can't use the fall. But prior to January 2024, so you could technically wait and use the one from their first grade year in the fall, correct?
Well, then would they still be a kindergarten student?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So it's the not when the screener is, it's when the student is enrolled.
Yeah, so if it's applicable to students in kindergarten, right?
Okay, gotcha.
That's my interpretation of it, but also an amazing question. And I love your brain, Stephanie, that you like.
Well,
No, I think it's beautiful. It's wonderful. And I think
I
it's
just,
something worth bringing to the table.
I hesitate to call any kindergartner a dyslexic. You know,
Right.
they come in with such a different level of, and you know, if you're doing this too early and suddenly we're telling a parent and teachers that this child has a marker or a tendency for dyslexia,
Right.
or how you identifying it and catching kids early. But I just think
Absolutely.
they're also developmentally.
Absolutely. And we know it happens on a continuum. And I think that kind of segues to some of the topics that we were going to talk about today, because I think we'd be remiss not to talk about students with disabilities as we're talking about tiers and interventions and additional supports. But at the same time, we have to know, do we have alignment across what that means? So if we say a student is identified with a risk or a tendency or a marker of possibly dyslexia, that's going to throw up a red flag for a lot of our teachers, as in like, oh, our practices then, once they're, you know, at risk from a universal screener, they go and they, you know, become a part of this next process that we have, right? And all of those things that we're doing, we have to be really careful, because we're going to have a lot of kids. I mean, we know from that ladder of reading, we know that we might have kids that 40 to 45% plus this 10 to 15%, that could have a risk or a tendency, right? And we also know that we have practices in place that when a risk is identified, we move on to a different team or a different intervention or things of that nature. So we have to make sure that we know as leaders how we define our tiers of support, what it looks like across our tiers of support, and where we go and what our next step is when a student has a risk. So I don't want to say that like, let's talk about students with disabilities first, because we know that at risk does not equal students with disabilities, but I think we'd be remiss not to take a moment and currently look at the data that we have for students with disabilities in Ohio. I'm going to pause and let everyone read through this instead of reading it to you. So knowing that we're going to be doing these screeners and we're going to have students that are already identified, especially in, first grade on up. What does that mean if they already are a student with disability? And then what does this data mean as it relates to additional students being, identified at risk? This data has remained the same essentially across the state, maybe has changed a few percentage points. But we're not meeting all of our learners, and we're especially not meeting our learners who are identified. So to me, this says once we identify a student for at risk for whatever it might be, this different light goes off of what they're able to do, what their expectations are. And to Stephanie's point, we need to know what lights go off for our teachers. Because if we're identifying a lot of students at risk, even though we all know that that does not mean they're a student with a disability, is that student automatically having less of an expectation put on them if we're identifying them at risk? The opposite should be true, right? It should tell the teacher that we need to be aware of that and be really specific and diagnostic about how we're going to fill that gap so that they aren't identified. Because we know that when a student is identified, unfortunately, we're still as a collective, state struggling with how to meet all learners' needs. So what will identifying a student at risk for dyslexia possibly trigger for your teachers? Because we know that even for our students who are identified with a disability, 80% have average to above average intelligence. 80%, but only 28 are performing. And then of the 13 disability categories that are a student in which a student can qualify under IDEA, only one of these categories, only one requires that the student have an intellectual deficit. So as we're rolling these out, what words are we using for at-risk readers, for students with disabilities maybe who are already identified? Because I just think of those kids, like if I'm coming in from Head Start and I'm already identified as a student with a disability, and then I'm determined to be at risk for dyslexia, what does that mean for my educational trajectory moving forward? Those are hard questions to have. And our practices oftentimes have been the reason why we've, created the dispositions that we've had. But we can't just implement a new phonics program or, phonemic awareness and embed that into our system if we don't know how we perceive our learners. So do we have alignment as a district, as a school, across our teams with our disposition, our core beliefs? And a lot of that's going to come in with an effective PBIS program and supports that behavior side of our MTSS program. Are we all equipped with the same knowledge as it relates to reading research and what we need to know in order to close gaps quickly and effectively? And then do we have the skills to do it? And this all takes time. But one way of doing that is just to start with simple self-reflection. So if we think about our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, what picture is painted? And I was going to walk us through an activity, and I'm going to move past it today because we spent a lot of really good time, addressing the realities that you guys are currently facing. So no problem there. But do our leaders, do our teachers, our specialists, our learners, and our families all define our tiers of support in the same way? And so we were going to rate our own self, like write down what we think tier 1 means and what it looks like and what it sounds like, who receives it. And then we were going to break apart each of these groups. Okay, how would our other leaders define tier 1, and et cetera for each group? And then based off of this definition here, which is in each child means each child, where do we have a lack of alignment? And those are the people that need to be at the table when we're having these discussions around changes we want to make to our systems of support and the development of our structured literacy program. So tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, these definitions are all from Each Child Means Each Child, which is Ohio's plan to improve learning experiences and outcomes for students with disabilities the kind of a lofty big document, but it parallels almost like to a T the language that you see in Ohio's Plan to Raise Literacy Achievement and the language you see in Ohio's Dyslexia Guidebook. All have the same message, right? So I'm going to skip walking through that activity today. And then we were going to share out as it relates to maybe some misconceptions or, you know, historical practices that led us maybe to some disconnects, or, you know, who has strengths and has alignment across their understandings. But knowing that House Bill 436 requires that identification, and then we have a lot of learners who are coming in with a gap in learning because of COVID and building shutdowns. We're going to have a rise in our students who need additional supports. So what does that look like? But we're going to move on from that. So we have two options here. I'm going to let you guys choose. We have a little bit of an activity or a discussion around supports for students who are possibly at risk, or students with disabilities, as it relates to scaffolding, accommodations, and modifications. What are the differences? And taking that knowledge that we would give you and applying that to using leveled readers. And then a kind of a discussion around that. That's option one, where we go right now. Or option two, we look at some resources and tools from the National Center of Intensive Intervention that talks about how we select interventions, what we need to consider for the selection of interventions. So whether that's interventions that historically you would see in a RIMP or a IEP, especially designed instruction, and then some tools that would help develop and support that selection process for intervention, and in addition to progress monitoring its effectiveness. So we can go down the discussion around level readers, kind of specific to a practice, or we can more holistically systems-wide intervention considerations. Option one, leveled reader. Option two, intervention. Put one in the chat if you prefer that. Leveled reader discussion, put number two in the chat if you prefer the holistic systems intervention considerations. Okay, we are all screaming two. If there is anything that you see in this PowerPoint, there something that you're like, oh man, I really wanted to like dig into that we didn't get to, please, by all means, reach out. Happy to have a discussion and brainstorm and talk through anything with you. So I am going to flip to, all right, it's gonna go this slide. It's about halfway through. So the National Center for Intensive Intervention is a place where you can get trainings, resources, online webinars, all around selecting effective interventions. Our last session, we looked at selecting good curriculum or the programs that we would use within our curriculum tools. So now we're going to talk kind of about what resources are available for looking at the interventions that we utilize and what are some things that we need to consider. So before we go into that, let's make sure that you all have the website. And it is in the Padlet as well. But all of the resources that we're going to eyeball today are here. And we're going to take a quick walk through some of the offerings. So I'm going to explicitly pull out some tools based off of your feedback from previous surveys, but wanted to let you know that based off of kind of like what we did before with the ed reports, looking at two different curriculums and then rating them, there is also a feature on the National Center's website where you can look at the evidence of the effectiveness of specific interventions. Okay, we're not gonna just like kind of have to get in the weeds with this and like really pull it apart. But what you can do is look at specific intervention programs for reading, and then look at the studies of whether they were determined to be effective, and what are the requirements for them as it relates to who needs to provide the service, how often does the program provide, like suggest interventions, what would the grouping look like, and then like the teacher usability component, like if we were to utilize this program for X type of intervention, how much training is required or not required, and how long will it take? This should not be, oh, we came here, it says it's an effective thing, it kind of meets our current schedule, we're going to use this. Because I want to caveat that one program might only be an intervention, a good intervention for one of our big 5 areas of reading. So for example, a phonics program on here, that's only going to support our students who have a phonics deficiency, right? Or whatever the sub-skill will be. So this tool is available to you, but they also have loads and loads of resources specific to, okay, we've identified needs, now what, right? So they have sample literacy lessons. They have specific resources and supports that will guide teams through selecting good IEP goals, progress monitoring those, how can we make the progress for those visual as well. And then each of these things, like of all the resources that they have, there is usually a module that goes alongside it. So you could have, you know, a teacher team if you want to talk about selecting interventions and you want the teachers to watch like a quick 10-15 minute video on how to select an intervention, and then you guys talk about it at a teacher-based team or whatever. Those resources within those modules are pretty quick, and I would say like each part is not as massively huge of an undertaking as some other modules that are out there. You could watch like little bits in 10-minute increments. Then if you have any coaching in place, or you're thinking about that multi-sensory literacy specialist who has that certification, and you want them to maybe utilize a coaching framework to monitor the things that you're putting in place to see if they're effective, there's a whole area specific to coaching supports that can be really effective on what does it look like, what would the requirements be, what would the expectations be for teachers, etc. So there's just a lot of things to see here, but I wanted to call out a few ones specifically. Because they have this whole thing, the taxonomy to find the best intervention, because we know there is no perfect intervention, right? We cannot have, just like we can't have one program equals our curriculum, which we know is just doesn't make any sense. We can't have one intervention for every kid who's identified at risk. There's just no correlation there, right? So using a system like this can help you to understand where you have strengths and weaknesses as it relates to your current interventions, and then support you in selecting additional interventions, right? So when we're bringing in a structured literacy program, it does not mean that we're doing this new intervention that's aligned to structured literacy. We need to look at our old practices. And if what we're doing isn't working, then we need to take it away, right? So how do you go about doing that? And what questions do you have to like put interventions up to when you're making those decisions? So these questions are a great way to guide those systems level discussions around intervention selection. So first of all, is there evidence that this intervention is appropriate and it leads to improved outcomes? So the strength of the intervention. We need to consider the dosage considerations for the intervention. What's group sizes required? What's the duration and the structure and the frequency? And how often do kids get the opportunity to respond and be engaged in it? You know, that dosage is an important thing, especially when you're thinking about schedules and teacher capacity, who you have available to provide interventions. we need to select interventions that match our identified needs, right, for our students. So does this program historically have alignment where we usually see our learning gaps? Attention to transfer. We're not just doing interventions for the sake of getting through an X grade, right? We want them to be able to take the skill and be able to utilize it in other spaces, especially those foundational literacy skills that are like the backpack of and the foundation of all of their learning for the rest of their career, right? So does it allow kids to apply it to outside context? Does the intervention include elements of explicit instruction? So is it comprehensive? What are the components of explicit instruction, and does it go through those and then offer maybe supports for specific learner needs who might need, additional repetition, which is a component of explicit instruction? And then does the student have opportunities to develop behavior skills to be successful in order to be able to use these skills? And can the intervention be easily integrated into academic instruction, right? So if I'm oftentimes if I'm receiving a support, like the first thing that comes to my mind is a speech and language pathologist, right? Where they're working on letter sound correspondence, maybe with a speech language pathologist. But speech language pathologist, that's a funny thing to mess up on and whatever. But anyways, and they're practicing certain sounds in relationship to letters. Can that be transferred to the classroom? Is there a way that I can print a report from this intervention program and give it to the classroom teacher and say, like, when you're doing this in the classroom, here's, what you can really focus on for X student. So does the intervention have that? And then does the intervention have some way of monitoring and collecting data to meet individual needs? All of these things are questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're picking intervention programs or intervention systems, but then also we need to apply these same questions to the individual learner, right? When we're selecting the appropriate intervention for them. So step one, if you're like, hey, I know that we're gonna have to do these structured literacy supports for kiddos who are identified at risk. Step one, what are you doing now? Run it through these questions. These questions also come with this here that kind of explains it more specifically, but then this is also in rubric form. So you could go through and score your current interventions and their effectiveness based off of these dimensions that we know are, all of this is a component of like research and practice, right? So in your Padlet, there are links to the rubrics and the different tools that could support a team to walk through this process. Do you have any thoughts or questions on that before we move to another tool or another consideration? Can you share the Padlet link again? No problem. Putting the Padlet link in the chat, and all of the materials for today are under session 8. And it's titled Interventions. Okay, so that's one piece, right? When we're systems level, do we have a place or somewhere where teachers know there's this bank of interventions available, and they've all been vetted and like screened to ensure that they meet all of these, right? These are, and say, hey teacher, here are teachers, teacher teams, RTI teams, MTSS teams. Here are the, the interventions, that programs that we have. In addition, we also know that there are effective practices that are going to support intervention programs in our tier 1 spaces and things of that nature that might not be like a program specific, right? So then we think about the student, right? So we have our bank of identified intervention programs. Now, what do we need to do with them, right? we utilize something for a child, we've determined what program they're going to, be used, and then we need to progress monitor it. I hate to say this, but I feel like oftentimes when we progress monitor, it's something that's, this case worker kind of does, or this case manager kind of does on their own every 9 weeks, just to make sure that they have the data that to correspond with X goal. But when we're progress monitoring, are we looking for actual progress? And if we do not see progress, then what is our next step? So if a child is not responding, then we need to stop doing that. We have to take it off, and we need to go back to our diagnostic data, right, that we dove into to determine, okay, where am I missing? Did I go back far enough? Did I go down to the specific skill where this kid has a gap? And we change our plan, right? And we look at our current intervention and we say, hey, based off of how often this intervention is effective, we know that this intervention program needs to be given 5 times a year. We've only been giving it to Debbie once, or 5 times, I'm sorry, not 5 times a year, 5 times a week. We've only been giving it to Debbie once a week. No wonder she's not responsive, right? So these are the conversations that we need to have, and then we can adapt or change our intervention, either the program, either the process that we're using, maybe the dosage. Maybe we're not transferring that skill to to what we're saying in the tier 1 setting. So this kid is only seeing it in this, bucket of time, and then, they have no ability to transfer because we're not, reinforcing what that child is learning and repeating that in our tier 1 setting. And then from there, we make those adjustments, and then we continue to progress monitor, right? We have this entire system in place. We're going to watch a quick video of this guru from the field. She's a reading specialist expert, and she talks about progress monitoring, because oftentimes progress monitoring is seen as this notion of compliance, right? But this needs to be guiding our instruction, right? And when we provide teachers and we provide specialists and intervention support individuals with valid intervention programs, they have the time to effectively progress monitor. They're not making up, small group activities. They're not having to spend all this time like printing off these little books and doing all these different things. If they are given the tools to have the right interventions and programs to pull from, then the meat of their time can be ensuring that they have the fidelity of implementing the intervention correctly and the way to monitor it to see if the child is progressing. Okay. This is Linda Farrell. What she does is she goes around to various schools and supports like a literacy specialist kind of, but like serves as an outside consultant. So she works with a lot of kids. So let me know, give me a thumbs up for those of you who have your camera on if you could hear this. Thumb down. Okay. I need to stop sharing and then do that like special thing for. Okay. All right, thumbs up if you can hear it now.
When I go to classes,
Great. Here we go.
when I go to classes, and patience is something that teachers remark. And there are 2 kinds of patience. One is I have patience to do it over and over and over again, and that's not really the kind of patience I have. I have the patience to do it over and over and over again when I see that there is incremental progress every time. If I'm doing something over and over and over again and it's not getting through, then I have to go, whoa, this is too hard for this student. How can I back down until I get to something that they can do so that then we can take the step back up here. So have patience, but it's important to understand that it's patience when the student's learning, not patience to keep doing the same thing and getting no results. There's one more kind of patience that teachers remark on, and that is, I don't give kids the answer. I wait until they either ask me, they say, I don't know how to do this, and then I can help them, which makes them own whether they know how to do it or not. And sometimes I just wait because they need more time to figure it out. When you're learning something, your brain has to process. My struggling readers often need more time for their brains to process than we think they should. If it takes 45 seconds to remember the name of the letter E, because the kid's going A, B, C, D, E, he's going to take that because the next time it'll take 44 seconds, and the next time it'll take 43 seconds. And I have to give the student the time to process. So does every teacher. When I
Any thoughts or ahas or links to current practices based off of kind of what you heard there, and then that taxonomy of interventions? Any thoughts?
She brings up a good point about, if something about the patients, if something isn't working, you're not going to continue to do it over and over and over again if it's not working. And I guess that's kind of like a self-reflective piece. And I know sometimes it's hard, being a teacher when you're trying something and it's not working and you're like, oh my goodness, this isn't working. What else could I be doing? And that's when you kind of have to talk and lean on your colleagues to kind of come up with a different plan. But that it's hard to do that because, if you've been teaching for a while, you think you kind of know the tricks of the trade and it's not working for one student, then you have to figure out a new plan. And that's not easy, but we have to figure it out.
I love that, Amy. And where in our systems do we offer teachers that time? Right. I think often empowering our teachers, like we have our TBTs and our teacher meetings and planning meetings. Are these the type of options that they're given? Or, like what's really guiding the work? Do they have this built into their teacher time? Any examples of having these discussions and changing based off of progress monitoring that anybody would like to share?
I actually love kind of what Amy was saying, like, this is really hard work and understanding that, from a systematic level, that this is really hard. And what Linda Farrell was saying, I thought is so important, that we only have patience when they're showing incremental movement forward. It's not the patience like, okay, I said I would do this intervention for, I don't know, however many weeks, and it's not working. But I'm going to power through it anyway, even though I'm not seeing any progress with this particular child. So, I love how thinking about this is really, really hard. And how do we put that in a systemic way? So this is the way we do business in our districts, because it is not easy work.
I think too, that idea of not looking at progress monitoring as a thing to do, but really watching how it is making a difference or not, and then adjusting versus it being something that is checked off like, well, I've done this many times, so I've proven that they have, this deficit, or they struggle in this area. It's like collecting data for the sense of collecting data versus really analyzing it.
Absolutely. And in order to do that, we need kind of supports built in and people that can help monitor how we're providing an intervention or modeling opportunities to see if, you know, to give us an idea of what it looks like. So I think oftentimes too, like, we can say all this and like, but the reality is like, we have the thinking that we have because that's what we've been taught, right? So like, what does it look like differently? I think is often something that we struggle with. So one of the additional things that Linda has available is looking at reading interventions. And she has this whole video series where she works with kids one-on-one. So you can see exactly how explicit she's getting as it relates to the skill set that she's focusing on, and then what it actually looks like when she's providing that intervention. So there are a variety, but they'll have an episode kind of per kid. And there's a facilitation guide in addition to a viewer's guide. So if you are, you know, a literacy specialist or you're coaching or supporting, you know, a group of teachers through something, you could use this to show how to model, you know, selecting a specific intervention, but then what it looks like throughout the process. So, for example, the facilitator guide is going to tell you exactly what to consider when you're using this with a team of teachers. When to use the viewer, or when to use the other guide, the viewer's guide, that they can fill out as you walk through this discussion. So what you could do is do this as an example, model how they identify, for this kid's Reese weakness. And then, okay, now we have our universal screening data for X classroom, and let's do the exact same thing and walk through what are the identified weaknesses and how could we, you know, from our pool of interventions, support this learner. And so that you have that immediate feedback given, like it's almost like using an I do, we do, you do to support teachers in the intervention process. So there's an entire series here. So in addition to that, when we're selecting supports or interventions for students, how do we have that ongoing, like almost job embedded progress monitoring? So the National Intervention Center has two different things. So like at the systems level, they have a checklist for you to be able to monitor the selection of the intervention for an individual learner. Like, what do we need to consider at this meeting where we determine how we're going to support this child? And then in that meeting, what are our next steps? When are we going to implement it? And how are we going to monitor it? So there's two different tools specific to that I wanted to bring up. So you have your interventions all available, you have all of these things, but then what does that look like when you're meeting with your teams? So this intervention meeting checklist, I think, is a great way to walk teams through what they need to consider when they're selecting an intervention for a child. Not only is progress monitoring often utilized as like a thing that we just do for the sake of collecting, like Sue Beth was suggesting, but I often think about too, like, this is the missing part of our IEP meetings, right? When we're talking about selecting specially designed instruction, what considerations are we having before the meeting so that when we go into the meeting, we have all the relevant information that we need to make a collective decision as a team. I mean, who sat on an IEP meeting and been like, okay, the law says I have to be here, but I don't understand why I'm here. And you didn't say a single word throughout the entire meeting. And you just kind of were like listening to somebody read an IEP to you. Anybody been in an IEP like that? Or an ETR meeting? Right. We have these structures in place, for example, IEP meetings. So instead of doing this new thing to support our identified students and for selecting interventions for students who might be at risk for dyslexia, what structures are we already using? What are we already doing for our RIP process or an IEP process? We have great structures there. Now let's just change how we do it and, you know, look at the roles of those team members through a different lens to see how they can support actually making a team decision. So this is great. This checklist is a great way to determine if you have everything you need before the meeting, but then it gives you considerations for during the meeting, in addition to considerations for after the meeting. Now, if during that meeting, we select an intervention for a child, and we all agree as a team, the parents there, they're like, cool, and you're like, okay, you're gonna get progress on this every 9 weeks. Wouldn't it be amazing and very clear and more straightforward to a parent if you were also able to show them at that exact time how you're going to progress monitor that intervention? And if your teachers even had a tool, if your teachers had a tool like this, right? Because how many, I mean, I know I made my own data charts every which way and they changed every year because I wasn't getting what I needed from my data charts. But if you had this on the start of the intervention cycle, it would help to ensure that you're embedding progress monitoring into the use of each intervention that you're providing. So you could, you know, monitor this as an individual intervention specialist, like an intervention log for a child, or it could be something that, you know, you do with a team. But what I really like about this is that it builds in those times for you to stop and reflect on your implementation and on the progress the child is making. So 5 times a week, I'm giving Debbie this one intervention. At the end of the week, instead of, you know, an intervention specialist having to write lesson plans, like maybe, you know, their tier 1 education teacher that they partner with, this is what that intervention specialist is doing, right? This is their lesson planning time. This is what they're reflecting on and progress monitoring to determine what their next step is going to be. And it just makes progress monitoring a job embedded practice so that we're actually knowing if what we're doing is making sense. And it's not just paperwork for the sake of paperwork there, when the focus is on implementation. Does anybody utilize something like this or have any thoughts about something like this? Like, Jackie, this would not be practical, or what are you guys thinking?
Last year, we started utilizing Branching Minds, and it has something like this, and it's an online platform, and you pick the intervention for the student, you select who's going to do it, you select how often you're going to do it. It will send you reminds to do it through your email. You will, after the intervention, you're supposed to mark, was it done? Did they attend? And things like that. Now, it is a lot because you're getting all of these notifications for every single student for every category that you're working on. So that's been kind of a work in progress. Some people have requested to have the reminds, the alerts turned off just because it is so overwhelming. We've also worked as a school district to try to better make use of our data meetings or our teacher meetings so that we're actually discussing the actual intervention, or let the data decide what the intervention should be, or if it needs to be changed. Because oftentimes when we get together, we're kind of just expressing what's happening and how they're doing, but it's not really specific to numbers. And so our admin team would like us to be more data driven and make better use and change our interventions. And it does feel like we feel like we're reinventing everything that we're doing every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, but it's to the benefit of the child. But I love paper, so I would definitely love this. And the person that I took over for, her lesson plans were quite like this, that she did a sheet for every day and marked if they were there. I mean, I keep it in my lesson plan book and I circle when they're here or when they're not here. Or if we had a fire drill or something like this, but this would be very specific and something very professional that could be sent on with that child and to their parents. I would feel good about preparing and sending and sharing all of that with the parent.
Thank you so much, Carol, for sharing. And you said that was Branching Minds?
Yes.
Branching Minds.
Yes. So they actually have they started looking at it to meet the PBIS component requirement, because you can track behavior, you can track any student that's on a tier, you can track any student that has a behavior plan, a speech plan, an IEP. And it would be absolutely fabulous, especially if we have transfer students, that all of that data just goes with that student if the other school district actually has it. But it is it is a very overwhelming site. So last year when we implemented it, we were to get training and we were going to do just behaviors. So anybody that had a behavior, since we were using it to meet the PBIS requirement. So anybody that had a significant behavior, that was going to be launched in there. You could write a report, you could write an incident report. But this year we're trying to like based on, it would work with, I know I'm all over the place here, but it would work with STAR. So we let the Branching Minds actually tier our students, like bulk rating them. So based on their STAR score and how many months they're behind or how many years they're behind, they would say that they're already at a tier 1, a tier 2, or whatever. Sometimes that did align with us and sometimes it didn't. So we had to have a discussion on, you know, if we felt it should be a different way, and you can override that. And then so once they're based on or identified that they are a tier, whether we do it or we let the system do it, then you can handpick the specific interventions for that child. And then the team or the teacher decides the frequency, and then you're supposed to do those interventions, and obviously, and then you can determine again if it's working or if it's not working, and if it's not working, pick another one. And they have a slew. I mean, there are so many. We were opting to use a lot from the Florida Center. Those were a lot of hand manipulatives, but can I say that we're using it as efficiently as it possible? Maybe not, but it's definitely something, if you've heard about it, there's a lot in there. So it does meet PBIS, you can do behavior, but we were really trying to track our interventions this year. One thing that we did do last year that we found that we should not have done is that we had 3 students that we were watching all year long, and we said, well, let's wait and see when they get into 1st grade, and maybe we would see how they benchmark and see how they screen, and let's determine if we need to move forward for testing. Well, we should not have done that, because if you mention those move forward for testing, then that locks you into that magic number that you have to move forward and get all the testing done. So we definitely should not do that again, but there is a place to document all your meeting notes and everything. So
Great.
it's
Thank
called
you so
Branching
much.
Minds. Yep.
Thank you. We'll open the floor for any questions about that. Looks like Karen also uses it, but Maria, you have your hand up.
So in TPS, ours, we have something similar to this that we created that are more so tied to RIMPs. So they are attached to a backside purpose. And also and our staff, this just really helps keep track and get that into a student's cume. So if they, go from one school to the next in the middle of the school year, which definitely happens for us, the next person can say, oh, here's what they've been doing for the student. Here's their interventions. Here's how often they've done them. Here's what they've tried. So it follows their RIMPs. I think I agree with you, though. You must have something there, even for our purpose, to keep track, because, you've got many students. So it helps, to keep things, organized. So I know what I'm doing. I got to remember to do it. Kind of forces you to focus on what we're doing for them. Also in that, for me as an educator, so that I know that I've been responsible, I've done what I need to be doing, kind of keeps me accountable, so that I can say, well, yes, I knew there was a problem. Here's what I did about it. So that, I know that I'm doing my job as well as an educator, just to keep me on track. So Amy, Megan, anything you want to add to that?
No, you pretty much hit it right on the head.
I agree.
But I think something has to be there. I agree. I mean, something needs to be there so that, we are accountable, so that we are keeping track of our kids and what we're doing for them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Any questions for Maria or Carol after that share out? Wonderful. So I think these are all amazing and great discussions. And the great thing about teachers, I feel like, is if we give them a support or something to utilize, they're going to take it, and usually they're going to make it better. And they're going to think about it through a lens that we haven't been able to, maybe, or, that might be something that they're already doing. So just a consideration, like, you could have a process in place, but is it being utilized? Is it being, does it have all the components of what we know is effective for ensuring fidelity of implementation? So once again, to that notion of, like, we're not just bringing something completely new to the table, right? Like, what are we doing currently? Is it working? What might be missing? And what's working well? And if someone's doing it well, can they be the model for other individuals who may need it, maybe for new teachers, what have you, or, long-term subs, et cetera, et cetera. So taking this all kind of just one step further, what are those considerations for effective implementation? I think when we say the word fidelity, my first thought is I just relate it to the instruction provided just by that teacher in that moment, utilizing X program. But within this are a lot of considerations that I oftentimes really didn't think about. I want to give you just a moment to look at this. I'll drop it in the chat. Before I share my two thoughts about this, does anybody have any, like, oh, that makes me think of this? So the biggest takeaway, I think, for me was twofold. Oftentimes when a teacher would, when I was a assistant principal and supporting a group of intervention specialists, they would say, the students like they don't care, they don't like this, blah, 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 it's boring, or like, and they're just not doing it. And so I can't really do anything. My hands are tied, right? Like, it's not my problem. It's kind of like a student problem. And like, we have more of a behavior issue in this intervention space than we do, a learning issue. And that's legitimately like a real concern, and something that oftentimes I feel like it's hard to nail down or, dig deep enough to know where the problem might be. And I think here, the student engagement component, like, are they attentive and involved in the intervention or activity? And before, I just saw that kind of as a separate thing from the quality of the delivery, the program specificity, the exposure or duration, or the adherence. But when one of these, let's say the adherence to the program, when that goes down, right, and we're not adhering to it, your student engagement could then be impacted and also go down, right? I never thought about implementation clearly through the lens of whether something is effective and how, if one area is not effective, it has impact on the other areas, right? And then as a teacher, I felt responsible for all of this, right? Like this was always too much. Like I couldn't do all of this. I needed to train myself on the, when I was supposed to do it. I had to create my own schedule for when I was going to take kids. I had to decide if, this teacher would even let me do it alongside her tier 1, and I could do it in a small group. And it was all kind of on me. So I was thinking it would be, a good conversation to have related to these specific areas, and then the questions underneath it, and who is responsible for these in your systems. Do us as leaders need to provide these components, or is it in tandem or in parallel with our educators and supports individuals providing interventions, or is it a combination of both? So looking at just like one of these buckets, adherence, how well we stick to the plan, curriculum, or assessment. Who is that the responsibility of? One, to ensure that we're adhering to it, and two, that it is being adhered to appropriately. Any thoughts? Is that the responsibility of the person providing the intervention? Is it a team responsibility? Is it a leadership responsibility? Or is it a combination?
Well, I think it's all of the above.
Yeah, I always say teamwork makes a dream work. And this has to be a collaborative effort. No one person could do it all.
I agree.
I think it's sometimes hard for, like, when you're talking about the adherence, while I'd love it if on TBTs, and this isn't so much related to specific interventions for individuals, but for just implementation of the program in general, the core program, and implementing it the way it's supposed to be implemented. You've got somebody sitting on your team that isn't doing it. But teachers sometimes aren't brave enough, strong enough themselves to say to a person who's not, hey, you need to do this, or how can I support you in doing it, because we know that you're not. So, I mean, it's obviously the responsible of the person doing it. It's their job to adhere to it and implement with fidelity, but it often falls on the principal to evaluate and have conversations if they've observed it. Sometimes it's hard for the principal to observe what is or isn't actually happening with Fidelity.
When we go in, it's hard for principals to get into classrooms, absolutely. And if we only have to go in a certain amount of time, and then like for OTES or something like that, and we have this slew of things that we have to like see and rate, that this can only be like one little part of it. So what, like as a leader and knowing our TBTs are going to be having these discussions, what supports, what structures can we put in place to ensure that this is being monitored and is the expectation and is something that we have as our supporting implementation, like part of our effective teaming structures, because we all know that we need to do these things, but the reality, it is a lot to do. So what are some ways that we can truly implement, I don't want to say, I keep using the word implement in various ways, but ensure fidelity to a program, to the quality of delivery, to all of these things, and really be able to monitor it and have rich discussions around it. What supports as a leader can you put in place to ensure that that's happening? So it's not the responsibility of coworker to coworker to essentially call someone out. To Stephanie's great example.
Well, we've experienced that at our school, and they are working on it. They've even done like our classroom teachers have to report on a public spreadsheet what marker they're hitting every week and where they're at and what level they're at. I think that has helped. I think they need to have a one-on-one, heart-to-heart conversation with these people that aren't teaching the program. I mean, I think our district in the past has looked at, we need to completely change our platform that we're using school-wide. And I've tried to say, it's not going to matter if you buy one program, 5 programs, keep the existing, if those key people still just dig in and do what they want to do. And it is making me a very frustrated person because I think the product that we have is a good product. And they're gonna, if they jump ship and totally change something else, those same people are not going to do the new program with Fidelity, and we're going to have the same issue. So it's a vicious circle. And I think the principals will even say, well, I have requested and I have stated and I have this and that. And I'm, yeah, yes, you have. And you have. And I know what those directives mean to those people, or what they should be meaning to those people, but it's still not happening. I mean, I think it's made some improvement. I can't say no improvement, but it's still not where it needs to be. And I absolutely believe our students deserve better. And I'm going to get emotional because our kids deserve better. Sorry.
No, I love that. Those are things that, those are real realities, right? And where do, knowing that if we're going to move forward with a new practice or a new program or a new X, Y, or Z, we have to acknowledge like these considerations. And sometimes it is, an individual that, and so like, it's almost like, what are our tier 3s for our staff who are not doing what we have embedded into our program? And like, we need to have a scaffold out of steps that we take for that. And those are real questions and things that we need to be having. And I completely agree with you, Carol, because oftentimes it's like, oh, well, we could bring in this new shiny thing and like, then that'll fix. And then like, oh, well, that didn't work. So let's pick up the next program. Oh, well, that didn't work. So this year we're going to focus on, only writing or whatever it might be. All things with the best of intentions, right? And it is easier to pick something up because we have a lot on our plates. But if we don't pull apart what we're currently doing and analyze that, and then decide collectively how we're going to monitor it, especially as it relates to tier 1, in addition to interventions and things that we're talking about today, then then we're just gonna keep with the same cyclical cycle, you know, and we're all gonna be exhausted at the end of it, still, regardless. So those are very hard, real conversations that we have to have. And so what kind of things can we put into our meeting structures, into our onboarding, into our professional learning, that constantly pull these considerations back to the table? Because we're all right now, and because of this legislation or for other means, you know, we're all at this point where we're about to make a lot of big financial decisions. And those financial decisions are going to be for programs or materials or tools or screeners that we're gonna have to be utilizing for however many years to come, right? So those are the hard conversations that we need to have. And if we don't, then you're right, then we're not giving our students what they truly deserve, in order to be able to actually just read, right? So I hear you, Carol. I appreciate you being courageous and bringing that up and talking about it to everyone. So we have like about 5 minutes left of our session today. I really appreciate all the engagement. It was great. Y'all like seriously made me like super happy. I wanted to make sure that we give you a little bit of time to fill out the survey for today's session. 2 things that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of. One, if you have not gotten the materials, like the free resource that you like selected, there was like 4 options or something, and we mailed them out like a few weeks ago. You should have received those. If you do not, and you're like me and you never check your mailbox, check your mailbox. And if it's not there, reach out and let me know. And then we'll make sure that we get you what you requested. The exit survey also has something specific to do with the last session that we had on the calendar. We had a to be determined June date, and we are going to not have extra content on that date, but hold it as like an office hours for those of you that would want it, if collectively we want to have that June date still. So that's one of the questions that is in the survey. And I don't want to call anyone out, but sometimes y'all kind of forget to do the survey, but please, please, please do this one, because we need to know what direction to kind of move forward with for our May session, and then if we're going to hold that June session. So take the last 5 minutes to take that survey. We will be here to continue the conversation, and we just really appreciate your time and for showing up. And y'all, you only have like a month left. Keep up the good work. If you did not receive your book, please send me an email. Just shoot me an email so that I can, and then if you remember what book you selected, that would be helpful. If not, I'll do digging on my end to see where we might have dropped the ball. Send me an email.
Hey, Jackie, just a quick question or clarification about the last question on the survey. Talking about the estimated, I just had to switch screens, I mute myself. Are you talking about the meetings that we're having now? Like the literacy network meetings?
So based on the network response, that one, we will hold June 16th as an open office hour. Or
Oh, okay. For some reason, I was thinking it was something else. Sorry.
is that the question or that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's the very last question on the survey.
Oh, yeah, that's like the end. That would be like the last one of this network for this
This
year.
network, for this year.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Jackie, I'm thinking that last question is actually talking about district availability for next year,
Oh,
not the last day.
Um,
wait. Are we looking at the same thing?
Maybe not.
I think the one in the chat link is last
Oh.
meeting's exit survey, and the one in the Padlet is the today's.
Oh,
I
that's
opened
where I
both.
goofed up. Okay. Well, then I'll make sure that I look over. both
Sorry.
of them. No, it's okay. I appreciate you saying that. All right, well, it's 11 o'clock. We are gonna sign off unless anybody had any questions. All right,
I so much appreciate all of you. Thank you.
we appreciate you. Keep up the good work. We have your back.
Thank you.
Bye.